Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into a world that vanished completely just over a century ago. Picture this: women who couldn't vote, couldn't own property after marriage, couldn't even show their ankles in public. Yet somehow they ruled society with an iron fist wrapped in silk and lace. These were the Edwardian ladies, the last queens of elegance, living in golden cages so beautiful, so perfectly constructed that most of them never realized they were trapped. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night. They knew. Deep down, they absolutely knew. And what they did about it? Well, that's a story that will take us through beauty, rebellion, scandal, and ultimately, the complete destruction of their entire world. So settle in, because tonight, we're stepping back to 1901, to a time when corsets could kill you and elegance was quite literally a matter of life and death. Now, before we slip into this world together, I need just a tiny favor. If you're already feeling that tingle of curiosity, if you're thinking, okay, I need to know where this goes, then please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. And here's something I genuinely want to know. Where are you watching from right now? Are you in bed with the lights low, on a quiet evening commute, in your favorite cozy corner? Drop a comment and let me know, because I love imagining all of you scattered across the world, all of us connecting through these strange, beautiful stories from the past. All right now, dim those lights if you can, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise, and let's step through time together. Let's go back to a world that was so elegant, so refined, so absolutely perfect on the surface, that it had no choice but to shatter. January 22nd, 1901, Queen Victoria is dead after 63 years on the throne, the longest reign in British history at that point. The old Queen has finally let go. And here's what's wild. People genuinely believed the world might end. Not metaphorically, literally. There were citizens of the British Empire who had never known another monarch. Victoria wasn't just a queen, she was practically a force of nature, a moral anchor, the stern grandmother of an entire civilization. Her rules, her values, her rigid sense of propriety had defined what it meant to be respectable for more than half a century. But now her son Edward is king. And Edward is everything his mother was not. See, Edward VII had waited 59 years to become king, 59 years as Prince of Wales, watching his mother disapprove of basically everything he did. And what did he do with all that waiting time? He lived, he travelled, he ate extravagantly. He had affairs, 55 documented romantic liaisons, including relationships with some of the most famous actresses and society beauties of his time. He gambled, he hosted parties, he wore the finest clothes. He was in many ways the world's most elegant playboy. And when he finally took the throne at age 59, he didn't suddenly become serious and stern like his mother. Instead, he turned the entire British aristocracy into his personal pleasure palace. This is where our story really begins, because Edward's ascension to the throne marked the beginning of what the French called La Belle Époque, the beautiful era. And for the women of the upper classes, this era was complicated, impossibly, fascinatingly complicated. Let me paint you a picture of what life looked like for an aristocratic woman in 1901 at the very peak of Edwardian elegance. You wake up in a bedroom that's probably larger than most modern apartments. Your lady's maid, and yes, you have one because getting dressed is literally a two-person job, comes in around 9 or 10 in the morning. You've slept in a cotton nightgown, your hair in curling papers, your face covered in cold cream. The morning routine begins. First, the undergarments, and oh my friends, the undergarments are a journey all by themselves. You start with a chemise, a light cotton or silk shift. Then comes the corset, Not just any corset, but the S-bend corset, the absolute height of Edwardian fashion. This magnificent torture device was designed by a French corsetière named Madame Gache-Sarraute, who genuinely believed she was doing women a favour by creating a health corset. The idea was simple. Instead of cinching the waist into an hourglass like Victorian corsets did, the S-bend pushed your hips back and your bust forward, creating an S-shaped silhouette when viewed from the side. The result? Something called the pigeon breast or monobosom. Basically, your entire chest got pushed forward and up into one magnificent, somewhat alarming shelf. Your lady's maid pulls the laces tight. You grab onto the bedpost because you need leverage. The corset compresses your lower ribs, forces your organs into new and creative positions, and makes breathing deeply pretty much impossible. Women regularly fainted from lack of oxygen. Some doctors believed correctly that long-term corset wearing could cause permanent damage to internal organs. But fashion, darling, fashion demanded it. Here's something that fascinates me. The ideal Edwardian woman wasn't young and girlish. No, the ideal was a mature woman, someone in her 40s or 50s, with a fuller figure, a dignified bearing, an air of experience. Queen Alexandra, Edward's wife, became a fashion icon at age 56. 56! Can you imagine that today, in our culture that's obsessed with youth, the idea that the most fashionable, most copied, most admired woman in society would be a grandmother in her 50s seems almost revolutionary. But there she was, setting trends, and every society woman tried to copy her style, her jewels, her way of moving through a room. After the corset comes the corset cover, because apparently one layer of structured torment isn't enough. You need something to protect your actual clothes from the corset. Then the petticoats, multiple petticoats. Depending on the occasion, you might wear anywhere from 3 to 6 layers of petticoats, each adding volume to your skirts. Then stockings, silk if you're wealthy, cotton if you're merely well off, held up with garters attached to your corset, and then, finally, the dress itself. Edwardian dresses were masterpieces of craftsmanship. We're talking hand-stitched lace, intricate beadwork, embroidery that took weeks to complete. The bodices were heavily boned, basically a corset within a corset, and fastened with dozens of tiny hooks and eyes up the back, which is why you absolutely needed a lady's maid. You literally could not dress yourself. The wealthy had separate bodices mounted onto lightly boned underbodices that gave even more structure, more shape, more of that extreme silhouette. At the front, cascades of lace, gathered fabric, ribbons, all designed to emphasize the low, forward-thrust bust line. The skirts were marvels too, fitted tight at the hips, then flaring out in a trumpet or lily shape. In 1901, hems were decorated with ruffles of fabric and lace. Some dresses had trains that swept behind you as you walked, collecting dust, making a statement. The whole outfit could easily weigh 15 to 20 pounds. Let me say that again. Women walked around in 15 to 20 pounds of clothing all day, every day. But here's the thing, and this is where it gets psychologically interesting. These women didn't just wear these clothes because they had to. Many of them genuinely loved the fashion. They felt beautiful in it. They felt powerful in it. Because in a world where they had very few avenues to power, fashion was one arena where they could compete, where they could make statements, where they could win. Let me tell you about the season. This was the annual ritual that defined upper-class life in Edwardian England, and it was basically a several-month-long marriage market disguised as a series of parties. The season began after Christmas and ran through midsummer. If you were a young woman from a wealthy family, say 17 or 18 years old, this was your moment. You would be presented at court, making your debut before the Queen. You'd wear a white dress with a regulation 3-yard train, and you'd be required to wear 3 white ostrich feathers in your hair. 3 feathers, no more, no less. This was protocol, and protocol was everything. You'd practice your curtsy for weeks, because when you were finally presented to Queen Alexandra, you had to execute a perfect curtsy, a deep, graceful bow that demonstrated your poise, your breeding, your worthiness to enter high society. One wobble, one stumble, and you'd be the subject of gossip for months. The pressure was enormous. Some girls fainted. Some forgot the curtsy entirely and had to be escorted away in disgrace. But if you succeeded, if you executed your curtsy perfectly and received the Queen's nod of approval, then you were officially out. You were a debutante. You could now attend balls, dinner parties, garden parties, race meetings, all the events that made up the season. And the entire point, let's be absolutely clear about this, was to find a husband. Love was optional. Nice if it happened, but not required. What was required was a good match. And good had very specific criteria: title, land, reputation, family connections. Your parents had been preparing you for this your entire life. You'd been educated in watercolors and piano, in French and Italian, in how to make polite conversation without ever saying anything controversial or interesting. You'd learned to ride horses side saddle, to play tennis in long skirts, to look beautiful while doing essentially nothing of substance. And here's the brutal truth. You had 1, maybe 2 seasons to make a match. If you didn't get engaged after your first season, you'd try again the next year. But if you were still unmarried by 21 or 22, you were starting to be seen as a failure. By 25, you were basically a lost cause, destined to become what they cruelly called a spinster, living in your parents' house, helping to raise your siblings' children, slowly fading into irrelevance. The marriage itself was rarely about love. It was a practical arrangement. The upper classes married to preserve land, to unite important families, to maintain their position in society. Land was everything. Land was the foundation of aristocratic wealth and power. The rental income from tenant farmers, the timber, the minerals, the agricultural yields, this was what kept the system running. And the system was designed to keep land in the family through the law of primogeniture. The eldest son inherited everything: the title, the estate, the houses, the art, the jewels, everything. His younger brothers got nothing except an allowance and whatever career they could cobble together in the military or the church. His sisters got even less: a dowry if they were lucky, and the hope that they'd marry well enough that their family wouldn't have to support them anymore. This is where the divide between old money and new money becomes really interesting. Old money families were the traditional aristocracy. Dukes, earls, viscounts, people whose ancestors had been granted land and titles for military service to the crown centuries ago. They had pedigree, they had history, they had breeding. But by the early 1900s, many of them were land-rich and cash-poor. Agricultural revenues were declining because of cheap grain imported from America and Australia. The empire was expensive to maintain. Their estates required constant upkeep. They needed money. Enter new money: the industrialists, the bankers, the businessmen who'd made enormous fortunes in manufacturing, in railroads, in finance. These men were often richer than the aristocrats, sometimes much richer. But they lacked the one thing money couldn't easily buy: social standing. So a deal emerged, an unspoken transaction that happened again and again during the Edwardian era. The aristocratic family with the title but no money would marry their son to the industrialist daughter with money but no title. She'd get to be a lady or a countess or even a duchess. He'd get her dowry, which would save the estate. Everyone would benefit. Except it didn't quite work that way in practice. Because the old money families made it very clear that the new money families were still inferior, still not quite good enough, still tainted by the smell of commerce, The new money wives would enter these grand houses and find themselves treated with subtle condescension. Yes, their money was welcome, but they were tolerated at best. The old money families would take their cash and still look down on them for not having the right bloodlines. This created a fascinating tension, a resentment that simmered under the surface of all those elegant parties. And the women, oh, the women felt this most acutely, because they were the ones who had to navigate these treacherous social waters, who had to know exactly where they stood in the hierarchy, who had to execute the complex dance of etiquette that governed every interaction. Let me give you an example of just how rigid the rules were. Edwardians never shook hands in greeting. Handshaking was considered too informal, too American. Women never removed their gloves in public, never. Men removed their hats in the presence of a social superior, but not for someone of a lower class. If you were hosting a dinner party, you had to create seating arrangements based on the order of precedence, an actual published ranking of every title and position in British society. The Duke sits here, the Viscount sits there, the Baron's wife goes here, but after the Earl's daughter goes there. Get it wrong, and you'd insult someone, and that insult would be remembered, discussed, held against you. Even among servants there was a strict hierarchy. The butler and housekeeper were at the top with the dignity and authority. Then the cook, then the valets and ladies' maids, then the footmen. At the bottom were the scullery maids, the kitchen maids, the grooms. They even sat at their own dining table downstairs in order of rank. The first footman served the meat, the prestigious course. The second footman served the sauce, less important. This obsession with rank and precedence permeated every level of society. And here's what's haunting about all of this. The women at the top of this system, the aristocratic ladies in their £20 dresses and their S-bend corsets, they enforced these rules most stringently. They were the ones who decided who was in and who was out, who could be invited to the best parties, who deserved to be cut dead on the street. They had so little actual power in the legal sense. They couldn't vote, couldn't own property in their own names once they married, couldn't pursue careers or higher education, so they wielded the power they did have with absolute ruthlessness. Social power. The power to destroy someone's reputation with a well-placed rumour, to ruin a family's prospects with a cold shoulder, to determine who mattered and who didn't. But even as they enforced the rules, even as they played the game perfectly, some of them were starting to feel the walls closing in. Some of them were starting to wonder, is this all there is? Is this endless parade of parties and costume changes and social manoeuvring the sum total of what a woman's life should be? In 1901, those questions were still whispers, quiet doubts that women barely admitted to themselves, because the system seemed eternal, unshakable, as permanent as the British Empire itself. The aristocracy had ruled for centuries. Why would that ever change? But change was coming. It was already in motion, actually, building like a wave that would crash over this elegant world and sweep it away entirely. In Paris, a designer named Paul Poiret was sketching dresses without corsets, dresses that hung straight down the body, that let women breathe. In America, a cartoonist named Charles Dana Gibson was drawing a new type of woman, athletic, confident, independent, with her hair piled high and her shirtwaist crisp, and her eyes full of intelligence and humour. In London, a woman named Emmeline Pankhurst was beginning to organise, to plan, to build a movement that would bring the entire establishment to its knees. But in 1901, at the beginning of the Edwardian era, none of that was visible yet. What was visible was the spectacle. The garden parties at country estates where hundreds of guests in their finest clothes strolled across manicured lawns. The race meetings at Ascot where the ladies showed off their most elaborate hats. Hats that could be 3 feet wide, decorated with entire taxidermied birds, ribbons, flowers, feathers. The yachting parties, the shooting parties, the endless round of dinners and balls where champagne flowed and orchestras played and everyone danced in their elaborate clothes until dawn. It looked perfect. It looked eternal. It looked like it would last forever. It would last exactly 13 more years. But tonight, in January of 1901, no one knows that yet. They're standing at the peak of something they believe will never end. They're the last queens of elegance, ruling over a world of beauty and order and impossible, suffocating perfection. And in that perfection, in that golden cage, the seeds of its own destruction are already starting to grow. So here's where we're going next. We're going to meet the woman who changed everything without even trying. The Gibson girl, that revolutionary image that made millions of women look at themselves and think, maybe I could be different. Maybe I could be more. We're going to talk about tailored suits that made men genuinely frightened, about women who walked into workplaces and refused to leave, about the tiny rebellions that started to crack the foundation of this seemingly perfect world. Because here's the secret about elegance, about perfection, about systems that seem unbreakable. They're always most fragile right at their peak. Right at the moment when everything seems most secure, that's when the ground starts to shift beneath your feet. So picture this. It's 1903, and across America, millions of women are opening their weekly magazines, the Saturday Evening Post, Life Collier's, and they're seeing something they've never quite seen before. A woman, but not just any woman. She's tall, confident, athletic. Her hair is piled high in a pompadour that adds inches to her height. She's wearing a crisp white blouse, what they called a shirtwaist, tucked into a simple skirt. No frills, no excessive lace, no cascading ruffles. Just clean lines, practical elegance. Her chin is up, her gaze is direct, and there's this look in her eyes that says, I know exactly who I am and I don't need your approval. Her name is the Gibson girl, and she's about to accidentally start a revolution. The artist who created her was Charles Dana Gibson, a man who somehow managed to capture lightning in a bottle with his pen and ink drawings. Gibson didn't set out to create a feminist icon. I don't even know if he would have called himself a feminist. He was just drawing women the way he saw them changing in real life. Women who were starting to ride bicycles and play tennis and attend college and work in offices. But in drawing them, in giving them this visual identity, he created something powerful, a mirror that women could hold up and say, that's who I want to be. And here's what's fascinating. The Gibson girl wasn't real. She was a drawing, an idealized image, no more real than any Instagram filter is today. But she felt real. She felt possible. And that possibility, that was dangerous. Because when women in London and Paris and New York started looking at the Gibson girl, they didn't just admire her. They started to ask themselves, why can't I dress like that? Why do I need 6 layers of petticoats when she's moving through the world in a simple skirt? Why am I suffocating in whalebones and steel when she looks so free? Let me tell you about the tailored suit, because this is where things get really interesting from a psychological standpoint. The tailored suit, or tailor-made as they called it, had technically been around since the 1880s. Fashion houses like Redfern and Creed in London had been making them for women who wanted practical clothing for travelling or informal daytime wear. But they were considered just that, practical, utilitarian, not fashionable, not elegant, certainly not something a lady would wear to make a statement. But then something shifted in the early 1900s. Women started wearing tailored suits not because they were practical, but because they liked them, because the suits made them feel different, capable, professional, independent. The suit consisted of a fitted jacket with lapels, buttons, and structured shoulders, paired with a long skirt and a high-collared blouse. It was inspired by menswear, and that was precisely the point. It was borrowing the visual language of male authority and adapting it for women. And men noticed, and they were not happy about it. There are newspaper articles from this period, I'm talking 1904, 1905, where male journalists are writing with genuine alarm about the mannish woman and her dangerous tailored suit. They called it an assault on femininity, a rejection of natural gender roles, a sign that women were getting ideas above their station. One particularly hysterical editorial claimed that women wearing suits were trying to usurp male authority, and that this would lead to the breakdown of civilization itself. Over a jacket, with buttons. But here's why they were really scared. The suit represented choice. It represented women saying, I don't have to dress for your gaze. I can dress for my comfort, my convenience, my work. And if women could choose their own clothes, well, what else might they choose? Their own careers, their own lives, their own futures? The answer, as it turned out, was yes, all of the above. By 1905, something remarkable was happening in cities across Britain and America. Women were flooding into the workplace. Not as domestic servants, that had always been a reality for working-class women, but as something new. White-collar workers, office workers, the rise of the typewriter, the telephone, and modern bureaucracy created thousands of new jobs, and women grabbed them. Have you ever thought about how revolutionary the typewriter was for women? I'm serious. Before the typewriter, office work was done by male clerks with pens and paper. It was considered men's work, requiring masculine skills and masculine endurance. But when the typewriter was invented, suddenly there was this new job, typist, that had no prior association with either gender. It was a blank slate, and companies realized they could hire women to do it for about half the salary they'd pay a man. Profit motive meets social change, and boom, an entire new career path opens up. By 1910, typing pools in major cities were almost exclusively female. Young women would arrive at offices in their tailored suits, hang their hats on the rack, sit down at their typewriters, and spend the day creating documents, taking dictation, managing correspondence. They earned their own money. They ate lunch at cafeterias with their co-workers. They had lives outside their parents' homes, outside the marriage market, outside the traditional paths that had been carved out for them. And let me tell you about the social panic this caused. Middle-class families were horrified at the idea of their daughters working like they were poor. The whole point of being middle or upper class was that your daughters didn't have to work. They were supported by their fathers until they married, and then supported by their husbands. A working daughter implied that the family couldn't afford to support her, which was shameful. Or worse, it implied that the daughter wanted to work, that she preferred independence to being taken care of, and that was seen as almost perverse. But the women kept coming anyway. They called themselves bachelor girls or working girls, and they rented boarding house rooms, pooled their money for shared apartments, created networks of female friendship and support. They went to restaurants unchaperoned, which was scandalous. They took evening classes to improve their skills. Some of them even went to suffrage meetings, which we'll get to soon enough, I promise. There was this emerging culture of young, independent women in cities, and it scared the establishment to death, because these women weren't dependent on men. They had their own incomes, they could make their own choices, and that fundamentally threatened the way society was organized. Now let's talk about what was happening simultaneously in the upper classes, because that's where things get really psychologically complex. Remember those aristocratic women we talked about before? The ones in the £20 dresses at the country house parties? They were watching all of this. They were seeing the Gibson girl in magazines. They were seeing working women in tailored suits on the streets. And some of them, not all, but some, were starting to feel something they couldn't quite name. A restlessness. a sense that the life they'd been born into, as comfortable and privileged as it was, felt like a cage. There's this wonderful quote from Lady Constance Lytton, an aristocrat who would later become a militant suffragette. She wrote about her youth in the 1890s and early 1900s, and she said something like, "We lived in a world of perfect comfort, perfect security, perfect boredom. Everything was decided for us. What we wore, where we went, whom we married. We were like prize cattle, beautifully groomed and completely without purpose. Can you imagine that? Having every material comfort, every luxury, and still feeling that deep, gnawing sense of meaninglessness. Because what was the point of an upper-class woman's life, really? She was born, educated in accomplishments that were purely decorative, married off to continue the family line, and then expected to spend the rest of her days hosting parties and making polite conversation. Her children would be raised primarily by nannies. Her household would be managed by servants. What was she for? Some women found meaning in that role. They became brilliant hostesses, powerful behind-the-scenes operators who wielded social influence like a weapon. They genuinely enjoyed the game of society, the intricate dance of protocol and precedence. And that's valid. There's nothing wrong with finding fulfillment in that life if it genuinely suits you. But others felt hollow, and when they looked at the Gibson girl, when they looked at the working women in their tailored suits, what they felt was envy. Not of the work itself. Good Lord, no one envied the tedium of typing for 8 hours a day. But envy of the purpose, the independence, the sense of being needed for something beyond their decorative value. This is where the tailored suit became really important for upper-class women too. By 1906, 1907, wealthy women were adopting the tailored suit not for work. They didn't work, but for daytime activities. They'd wear suits for shopping, for walking in the park, for taking the train to London. And the psychological effect was subtle but real. Wearing a suit made them feel different, more capable, more modern. Like they were participants in this changing world rather than just ornamental fixtures. The fashion industry adapted quickly. High-end designers started making luxury versions of the tailored suit, still simple in silhouette, but made from the finest wool, with hand-stitched details and silk linings. You could tell the difference between a working girl's suit and an aristocrat's suit, but they shared the same basic DNA. The borrowed authority of menswear, the rejection of excessive femininity, the implication of purpose and movement. And here's a detail I love. Even Queen Alexandra, the fashion icon herself, started wearing tailored suits for certain occasions. She'd wear them for travelling, for inspecting troops, for more active public appearances. She was in her 60s by this point, and she wasn't trying to look young or girlish. She was trying to look appropriate for what she was doing, and that appropriateness included borrowing elements of masculine dress when the occasion called for it. But let's be real for a moment. We're still talking about a society that was deeply, fundamentally unequal. The women wearing tailored suits, whether they were working girls or aristocrats, still couldn't vote. They still had limited legal rights. A married woman's property still legally belonged to her husband. If she worked, her wages legally belonged to him too. If she left him, he had automatic custody of the children. The courts, the government, the churches, all of it was controlled by men. So yes, the Gibson girl in the tailored suit represented change. But it was change within very strict limits. It was women saying, let us breathe a little easier, let us move a little more freely, but not yet saying, let us have actual power. Not yet. There's this phenomenon in social change where surface changes happen first. Fashion, culture, manners, and they seem almost frivolous, almost silly. But those surface changes create the psychological space for deeper changes to follow. When women got used to wearing suits, they got used to feeling capable. When they got used to feeling capable, they started wanting opportunities to demonstrate that capability. When they started wanting opportunities, they started demanding rights. It's like dominoes, you know? The Gibson girl looks harmless, she's just a drawing in a magazine. The tailored suit looks harmless, it's just a jacket and skirt. But these small, seemingly superficial changes in how women presented themselves to the world created a shift in how they saw themselves. And that internal shift, that was the earthquake that would eventually bring down the whole system. Let me give you a specific example that I find particularly moving. There was a woman named Florence Desmond. Not famous, just an ordinary middle-class woman from Birmingham. She kept a diary that was later found and published. In 1903, when she was 22, she wrote about buying her first tailored suit to wear to her job as a secretary. She describes going to work in her new suit and feeling, for the first time, like she belonged in the office. Like she wasn't a girl playing dress-up in a man's world, but a professional in her own right. And then she writes something that just breaks my heart in the best way. She says, "Today I walked past a group of men on the street, and usually I would have looked down, made myself small, hurried past. But in my suit I felt different. I looked straight ahead. I took up space, and no one stopped me. No one said anything. I was just allowed to exist in my own body, in my own space without apology. Is this how men feel all the time? Is this how men feel all the time?" What a question. What a devastating, beautiful question. And you know what's wild? We're still in 1903, 1904, 1905. We're still 6 or 7 years away from the suffragette movement really exploding into violence and headlines. We're still a decade away from World War I. Everything I'm describing, the Gibson girl, the working women, the tailored suits, this all seems so mild compared to what's coming. This is the beginning. This is women testing the waters, seeing how far they can push, discovering that they want more than they thought they wanted. Because here's the thing about awakening. It's not comfortable. It's not a smooth, pleasant process. It's disorienting and frightening and exhilarating all at once. These women were raised to be decorative, to be agreeable, to find their purpose in serving men and raising children. And then suddenly there's this alternative vision, the Gibson girl, confident and capable, and their brains are trying to reconcile what they've always been told with what they're now seeing as possible. Some women rejected it entirely. They doubled down on traditional femininity, argued that all this modern nonsense was destroying what made women special and valuable. And I have sympathy for that position, actually, because change is scary. The old world might have been limiting, but it was at least predictable. You knew the rules, you knew what was expected. This new world of working women and Gibson girls, nobody knew where it was heading. It felt like chaos. But other women felt like they'd been waiting their entire lives for permission to become themselves. And the Gibson girl, as fictional as she was, gave them that permission. She said, "You can be beautiful and capable. You can be feminine and strong. You can want more than what you've been offered, and that doesn't make you unfeminine or unnatural. It makes you human." And so they began to change. Slowly, incrementally, one tailored suit at a time, one typing job at a time, one moment of walking down a street with your head up and your shoulders back, taking up space without apology. The queens of elegance were still sitting in their country houses, laced into their corsets, playing by all the old rules. But on the streets of London and New York and Paris, a new kind of woman was emerging. She didn't have a crown, she didn't have a title. She might not even have enough money to buy a second pair of shoes, but she had something the queens in their golden cages were just beginning to realize they wanted. She had herself, her own life, her own choices, her own future, whatever that might be. And the women watching, both the working girls and the aristocrats, were starting to wonder, If she can have that, why can't I? But of course, wanting something and getting it are two very different things. And what happens next in our story is what always happens when people start demanding things that threaten the established order. The established order fights back. Hard. We're about to enter the world of scandal, secret affairs, and the hidden lives of the women who seemed most perfect on the surface. Because while some women were fighting for independence in tailored suits and typing pools, other women were finding their own forms of rebellion in much more, let's say, creative ways. And trust me, when I tell you what was really happening behind the closed doors of those country house parties, your jaw is going to drop. You know what's funny about history? We tend to think of the past as more proper, more restrained, more morally upright than our own messy present, especially the Edwardian era. When we picture it, we see those formal photographs, everyone standing stiffly in their elaborate clothes, looking dignified and controlled. We imagine a world of rules and propriety and perfect behaviour, and then you actually read their private letters, their diaries, the gossip columns of the time, and you realise, oh, these people were wild. Let me tell you about the real social life of Edwardian high society, because what happened behind closed doors was so dramatically different from the public facade that it's almost like they were living double lives. And in many ways they were. We need to start with the phenomenon of the country house weekend party, because this is where everything happened. Everything. These weekend parties were the backbone of aristocratic social life, especially during the summer and autumn months. A wealthy family would invite anywhere from 15 to 40 guests to their country estate for a long weekend, Friday through Monday usually. The guests would arrive by train, be picked up by carriages, and enter into what was essentially a 4-day theatrical performance where everyone was playing a role. On the surface, it was all very respectable. Mornings were for leisurely breakfasts, reading newspapers, writing letters. Men would go shooting, pheasants, grouse, whatever was in season, and women would gather in the drawing room for needlework and conversation. Afternoons might include walks in the gardens, tennis parties, perhaps a drive through the countryside. Everyone would dress for dinner, and I mean really dress. Full evening wear, jewels, tiaras if you had them, and sit through elaborate multi-course meals that could last 3 hours. After dinner there might be music, cards, parlour games, very civilised, very proper. But here's what the history books often skip over. These house parties were also where aristocratic society conducted its romantic affairs, openly, with the full knowledge of everyone involved, including spouses. Now, I need to be careful how I explain this, because it wasn't chaos. There were rules, very specific rules about how affairs were supposed to be conducted. You couldn't just openly flirt with someone else's spouse at dinner, that would be vulgar. But there was this understood system, almost like a code, where if you were having an affair with someone, you could arrange to be invited to the same house party, and then at night, after everyone had retired to their rooms, you could visit. The houses themselves were designed to facilitate this. Bedrooms were arranged along long corridors, and there was this tradition of placing a small card holder outside each door with a guest's name. Officially, this was so people wouldn't get lost in these massive houses. Unofficially, it was a map. You knew which room your lover was in, and as long as you were discreet, as long as you didn't get caught by servants or create a scene, it was tolerated. The thing is, marriages in this class weren't about love. We talked about that before. They were about property, alliances, continuing the family line. So the understanding was, you marry appropriately, you produce an heir and a spare, meaning at least 2 sons, and after that you're free to have discreet affairs as long as you maintain the public facade. Don't embarrass your spouse. Don't cause scandal. Don't have illegitimate children that everyone knows about. But beyond that, the rules were surprisingly flexible. King Edward VII himself set the tone for all of this. Remember those 55 romantic liaisons I mentioned? These weren't secret. Everyone in high society knew about them. His affairs with actresses like Lily Langtry and Sarah Bernhardt were discussed in whispers at parties. His relationships with aristocratic women like Alice Keppel, who remained his mistress for years, were common knowledge. Queen Alexandra knew. She tolerated it with what everyone described as remarkable grace and dignity. Because that was the role. The wronged wife was supposed to be gracious about it. To make a fuss would be middle class, emotional, embarrassing. And here's what I find psychologically fascinating. Many of the women in these affairs were older. Not young girls, but women in their 40s, 50s, even 60s. Because remember, Edwardian society valued maturity in women. An older woman who knew how to conduct an affair discreetly, who understood the rules, who could be witty and charming and wouldn't create drama. She was valuable. She was desirable. There's this incredible quote from Daisy, Countess of Warwick, who was one of Edward's mistresses. She wrote in her memoirs, "We resented the new morality which was creeping in. We were not hypocritical. We simply had different rules than the middle classes, rules that allowed for human nature and human desire, while maintaining the structures that kept society functioning." Can you hear what she's saying there? She's essentially arguing that aristocratic immorality was more honest than middle-class morality, because at least they weren't pretending. They weren't claiming to be perfectly faithful while sneaking around in secret. They were just open about it, within their own circles at least. But here's the catch. This only worked if you were married. If you were a young, unmarried woman, a debutante, a girl in her late teens or early 20s, you had to be completely above reproach. Your virginity, your reputation, your complete innocence had to be unquestionable, because your value on the marriage market depended on it. One hint of scandal, one rumour of impropriety, and you could be ruined. No respectable man would marry you. Your family would be disgraced. So you had this bizarre double standard where married women had more social freedom than unmarried ones. Once you'd successfully married and produced children, you'd earned a certain amount of latitude. But before that, you were chaperoned constantly. You couldn't be alone with a man who wasn't your relative. You couldn't even receive a letter from a man without your mother reading it first. The surveillance was intense. And yet, and this is where it gets really interesting, even within these restrictions, young women found ways to bend the rules. There's this wonderful tradition called the tea gown that perfectly illustrates the complexity of Edwardian female life. A tea gown was a dress worn in the late afternoon, typically between 5 and 7 p.m. in the privacy of your own home. Unlike the structured, corseted dresses women wore in public, tea gowns were loose, flowing, comfortable. They were made of soft fabrics, silk, chiffon, delicate cotton, often in pastel colours, decorated with lace and ribbons, and crucially, they didn't require a corset underneath. You could breathe, you could move freely, you could actually relax. Tea gowns were worn for intimate gatherings, just family or very close friends. And because they were so informal, so personal, there was something almost transgressive about them. A woman in a tea gown was a woman in a state of semi-undress. Not literally, of course. The dresses covered you completely, but psychologically, symbolically, you were showing a side of yourself that the public never saw. You were being real instead of performing. And here's the kicker. Men absolutely loved tea gowns. There are letters from Edwardian men describing how attractive they found women in tea gowns precisely because they were so different from the structured, armoured clothing women wore in public. The tea gown suggested accessibility, intimacy, a dropping of the formal facade. It was in a weird way more suggestive than actual evening gowns with their low necklines, because it implied privacy and vulnerability. So aristocratic women used tea gowns strategically. If you were having an affair, you might arrange for your lover to visit during tea gown hours, when the relaxed dress code created an atmosphere of intimacy. If you wanted to signal to a potential lover that you were interested, you might invite them for private tea in your sitting room, where you'd be wearing your tea gown. It was a language, a code, a way of communicating desire while still technically maintaining propriety. The whole system was extraordinarily complex, like this elaborate game where everyone knew the rules, but no one spoke them aloud. And women became absolute masters at playing this game. They had to be, because the stakes were so high. Let me tell you about one woman in particular, Lady Constance Stewart Richardson. Not a super famous name, but her story is illustrative. She was married young, at 19, to a Scottish aristocrat in an arranged marriage. The marriage was functional. They had 3 children in quick succession, fulfilling the requirements. And then, once she'd done her duty, Lady Constance started having affairs. Discreetly, of course. Always discreetly. She kept a private diary, which, brave woman, very dangerous. And in it she writes about the strange duality of her life. During the day she's the perfect lady, hosting luncheons, managing servants, visiting the poor on her husband's estate, which was expected of aristocratic women. You were supposed to do charity work, bring baskets to sick tenants, that sort of thing. She writes about reading to her children in the nursery, about arranging flowers, about all these domestic activities that filled her days. But then, at night, when her husband had retired to his own bedroom, yes, they had separate bedrooms, that was standard in upper-class marriages, she would transform. She'd put on one of her tea gowns or a more elaborate negligee, and she'd receive visits from her current lover. And she writes about feeling like 2 different people, the respectable Lady Stewart Richardson by day, and someone else entirely by night, someone who had desires and passions and made her own choices. And here's what breaks my heart a little. She writes about how the affair made her feel alive in a way her marriage never did. Not because her lover was particularly wonderful, she's actually quite critical of him in her diary, complaining about his conversation and his vanity, but because she chose him. In a life where almost nothing was her choice. Not her husband, not her children's education, not where she lived or how she spent her days. This one thing, this affair was hers. Her decision, her secret, her power. Does that make sense? Can you see how twisted the system was? That the only way a woman could feel autonomous was through something that was technically forbidden but socially tolerated as long as it stayed hidden? And listen, I'm not romanticizing affairs here. Plenty of them were messy and painful and caused real suffering. Wives who tolerated their husbands' mistresses weren't always gracious about it. Many of them were deeply hurt but had no recourse, no way to object without being seen as hysterical or unreasonable. And men had all the power in these dynamics. A man could have affairs and face no consequences. A woman could have affairs and be completely ruined if she wasn't careful, if she didn't follow the unspoken rules perfectly. But what fascinates me is how women learned to navigate this system, how they found agency within its constraints. They became experts at reading social cues, at managing reputations, at the art of suggestion and implication. They learned to communicate entire novels' worth of meaning with a glance, a tone of voice, the way they held their fan. Oh, the fan language. Have you heard about this? There was supposedly this whole code where different ways of holding or moving your fan meant different things. Holding it in your right hand meant yes, left hand meant no. Touching your lips with it meant kiss me. Drawing it across your forehead meant we're being watched. Now historians debate how much this was actually used versus how much it was invented later by Victorians who were nostalgic for a more romantic past. But even if it wasn't as systematic as the legends suggest, the principle is real. Women in this era communicated in code because they had to. Direct speech was too dangerous, too revealing, so they developed subtle languages of gesture and implication. And then there were the servants. Oh my God, the servants. Because here's something modern people often forget. Nothing that happened in these houses was actually private. There were servants everywhere. Your lady's maid dressed you and knew exactly what you wore and when. The footman delivered notes and messages. The housemaids cleaned your room and saw everything you left behind. The whole affair system only worked because the servants kept quiet. And they did keep quiet mostly because their jobs depended on discretion. An upper servant in a good house, a butler, a lady's maid, a housekeeper, could earn a decent living and had a certain amount of security. Speaking about what you saw, gossiping about your employer's private lives was grounds for immediate dismissal without a reference. And without a reference, you couldn't get another good position. So servants learned to see without seeing, to know without knowing. They became almost invisible, which was exactly what their employers wanted. But they were still people, with their own thoughts and judgments. And there are some servant memoirs from this period that are absolutely scathing about the hypocrisy of their employers. One housemaid, Margaret Thomas, wrote years later about working in a grand house where the lady of the house was constantly preaching about moral virtue to the servants, insisting on their absolute propriety, firing a kitchen maid who got pregnant, while simultaneously conducting multiple affairs herself. Margaret wrote, "They had one set of rules for us and another for themselves. We were supposed to be pure as angels while they lived like devils in silk stockings." Harsh, but you can understand the resentment. The servants worked 17-hour days in difficult conditions for low wages. They lived in cramped quarters in the attics or basements. They had almost no privacy, no personal freedom, and meanwhile their employers were living in luxury, spending their days in leisure and conducting elaborate romantic intrigues. The cognitive dissonance must have been intense. But here's something that surprised me when I learned it. Some of the ladies' maids became almost like co-conspirators with their mistresses. If you were a woman having an affair, your lady's maid knew everything. She prepared you for your assignations, she covered for you if needed, she disposed of incriminating evidence. And in exchange, a generous mistress might give her maid her old clothes, extra wages, perhaps even a small legacy in her will. There could be genuine affection in these relationships, a kind of alliance between women, even across the class divide. Though, of course, it was never an equal alliance. The maid had no choice but to comply. The mistress held all the power. But within those constraints, some version of trust and even friendship could develop. Human relationships are complicated, you know? Even in deeply unjust systems, genuine connection can exist. So this was the hidden reality of Edwardian high society, a world of secret affairs conducted with elaborate discretion, of women finding small freedoms within huge restrictions, of servants knowing everything and saying nothing, of tea gowns and private visits and carefully maintained facades. The public saw perfection and propriety. Behind closed doors, it was something else entirely. And you know what's really interesting? This double life, this constant performance of respectability while doing whatever you wanted in private, it couldn't last. The tension was unsustainable. Because eventually some women started asking, why do we have to hide? Why do we have to maintain this exhausting facade? Why can't we just be honest about who we are and what we want? Those questions were dangerous, revolutionary even, because once you start questioning one part of the system, it becomes hard to stop. If you can question whether affairs should be secret, you can question whether marriages should be arranged. If you can question whether women should have to pretend to be pure and passionless, you can question whether they should have the right to control their own bodies, their own lives, their own futures. And some women were starting to ask those questions, loudly, in public, with a willingness to face the consequences that would make the secret affairs of the country house parties look tame by comparison. They were getting organised, they were getting angry, and they were about to make themselves impossible to ignore. October 10th, 1903. In a small house in Manchester, England, a group of women gather in someone's living room. There's tea, of course. There's always tea. But this isn't a social call. These women are here to form an organisation. They call it the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU, and the woman at the centre of it all, the one who called this meeting, is a 45-year-old widow named Emmeline Pankhurst. Now, if you were to see a photograph of Emmeline Pankhurst from this time, you might be surprised. She doesn't look like a revolutionary. She's tiny, barely 5 feet tall, with delicate features and this incredibly elegant way of dressing. She looks like she should be hosting tea parties and embroidering cushions, not organising what would become one of the most militant political movements in British history. But that's exactly what makes her so fascinating. She understood something crucial, that in a world that dismissed women as weak and emotional, looking impeccably respectable while demanding the impossible was a form of warfare. But let's back up a bit, because to understand the suffragettes, and yes, that's what they'd become, though the term was originally an insult, we need to understand that this didn't come out of nowhere. Women had been asking for the vote for decades, politely, respectfully, through proper channels, and they'd been ignored, completely, systematically ignored. The constitutional suffragists, led by women like Millicent Fawcett, had been petitioning Parliament since the 1860s. 40 years of letters, meetings, reasonable arguments, careful lobbying. They'd organised, they'd fundraised, they'd written eloquent essays explaining why women deserved political representation. And Parliament would listen politely and then vote no every single time. Or worse, they wouldn't even bring it to a vote. They'd just ignore it. Laugh about it in private. Make jokes about hysterical women wanting things they couldn't understand. Emmeline Pankhurst had been part of those constitutional efforts for years. She'd believed in the system, but by 1903 she was done waiting, she was done being polite, she was done playing by rules that were specifically designed to keep her powerless. And she made a decision that would change everything. If they wouldn't listen to reason, she would make them listen to disruption. The WSPU's motto became deeds, not words, and they meant it. At first, the tactics were relatively mild. They would attend Liberal Party political rallies. The Liberals were supposed to be the progressive party, the ones who might support women's suffrage, and they would ask questions. Simple questions like, will the Liberal government give women the vote? And when they were ignored or dismissed, they would refuse to leave. They'd stand up and keep asking, keep interrupting, make it impossible for the speakers to continue until they were physically removed from the venue. This sounds tame to us now, but in 1905 it was shocking. Women did not disrupt political meetings. Women did not make scenes in public. Women certainly did not get themselves physically dragged out of rallies by police officers. It violated every rule of feminine behaviour, every expectation of how respectable women should act. And that was precisely the point. In October 1905, 2 WSPU members, Christabel Pankhurst, Emmeline's daughter, and Annie Kenny, a working-class mill worker, attended a Liberal rally in Manchester. They asked their question about women's suffrage. They were ignored, so they unfurled a banner that read "Votes for Women" and refused to leave. The police were called. Christabel, in the scuffle, deliberately spat at a police officer, a calculated act of minor assault designed to get herself arrested. It worked. She was arrested, tried, and sentenced to jail. She refused to pay the fine. She went to prison, and suddenly the newspapers couldn't ignore the story anymore. "Respectable ladies jailed for political protest" was a headline people wanted to read. It was scandalous. It was shocking. It was fascinating. And that media attention, that was exactly what the suffragettes wanted. Because as long as they were being polite, nobody paid attention. But create a scene, break the rules, get arrested. Now you're interesting. Now you're news. Do you see the genius of this strategy? They understood something that activists have understood throughout history. If you don't have official power, you have to create disruption. You have to make it more uncomfortable for people to ignore you than to deal with you. But here's where it gets really psychologically complex. Who are these women? Who are the suffragettes who are willing to get arrested, go to prison, sacrifice their reputations for this cause? You might assume they were all working-class women with nothing to lose. And yes, there were working-class suffragettes like Annie Kenney, women who understood firsthand how powerless they were without political representation. But what's striking is how many upper-class and upper-middle-class women joined the movement. Women who had everything to lose. Women from families with titles and estates and impeccable reputations. Lady Constance Lytton, yes, the same one I mentioned before, became a militant suffragette. She was the daughter of a viceroy of India, sister to a member of parliament. She'd been presented at court. She had all the privileges that wealth and aristocracy could provide. And she gave it all up to join a movement that her family and social circle considered disgraceful. Why? Why would a woman with every material comfort risk everything for something abstract like the vote? She wrote about this in her memoir. She said, and I'm paraphrasing, but this is the essence, "I realized that my comfort was built on a lie, that I was only valued as a decorative object, not as a thinking, feeling human being, and that until women had political power, we would never be truly seen as people. We would always be property, pets, pretty things to be managed by men, and I could not live with that knowledge and do nothing." That's powerful, right? She's essentially saying, I can't unknow what I now know. And once you can't unknow something, you have to act on it, even if the cost is enormous. The WSPU grew rapidly. Within a few years, they had thousands of members across Britain, and their tactics escalated. They moved from disrupting meetings to chaining themselves to railings outside government buildings. They would chain themselves to the railings at 10 Downing Street, the Prime Minister's residence, and refuse to move until police cut them free. Why chains? Because it made them harder to remove. It forced the confrontation to last longer, created a bigger scene, got more media attention. They started heckling members of Parliament. They would infiltrate Parliament itself, disguised as cleaners or hiding in supply closets, and then interrupt proceedings from the gallery shouting votes for women before being dragged away by security. They broke windows. This became a signature tactic. In 1912, there was a coordinated window-smashing campaign where suffragettes simultaneously broke windows at government offices, shops, and banks across London's West End. 200 women were arrested in a single day. The cost of the damaged property was enormous, and that was the point. They were making suffrage expensive to ignore. Now, I need to pause here and acknowledge something. This is where modern opinion on the suffragettes gets really divided. Because yes, they were fighting for a righteous cause. Yes, they were denied basic rights and had no peaceful avenue to obtain them. But they also engaged in what would absolutely be called terrorism if it happened today. They weren't just breaking windows. By 1913, they were setting fires, bombing churches. There was an attempt to blow up a house being built for Chancellor of the Exchequer David Lloyd George. These weren't symbolic acts anymore. This was actual intentional property destruction meant to inspire fear and force political change. The WSPU's position was essentially, we've tried everything else. We've been patient for 50 years. They've left us no choice but violence. If the government responds to men's violence, to riots, to rebellions, but ignores women's peaceful protest, then we will give them violence too. We will make the cost of denying us the vote higher than the cost of granting it. And I don't know what to tell you about whether this was justified. I think you have to sit with that complexity. They were fighting an unjust system that gave them no legitimate avenues for change. But they were also destroying property and risking lives. Both things can be true simultaneously. What I do know is that the government's response was brutal. Suffragettes who were arrested were sentenced to hard labour. When they went on hunger strikes, refusing food as a form of protest, the government responded with forced feeding. And forced feeding was torture. There's no other word for it. Let me describe what this involved because I think it's important to understand the physical reality of what these women endured. The prisoner would be held down, strapped to a chair or held by multiple warders. A tube would be forced down her throat or up through her nose. Sometimes the tube would be inserted incorrectly and pierce the lung or stomach lining. Sometimes the prisoner would vomit and choke. The process was excruciatingly painful. It caused long-term damage to the throat, the digestive system, the nervous system. One suffragette, Eveline Hilda Burkitt, was force-fed 292 times between 1909 and 1914. 292 times. Can you imagine the trauma, the pain, the psychological horror of knowing it would happen again and again every time you were arrested? Mary Richardson, another suffragette, described it as torture and an immoral assault. She said it felt like rape, the violent invasion of her body by the state, the complete removal of her autonomy and dignity. These weren't political prisoners being detained. They were being physically violated as punishment for demanding basic civil rights. And here's something that makes it even darker. When upper-class suffragettes were arrested, they often received better treatment than working-class ones. Lady Constance Lytton discovered this when she was arrested under her real name and given relatively gentle treatment, allowed to have her own clothes, served better food, not force-fed because the prison doctors claimed her heart was weak. She was furious, not at receiving better treatment but at the injustice of it. So you know what she did? She disguised herself. She dressed as a working-class woman, gave a false name, Jane Wharton, and deliberately got herself arrested again. And this time, with no aristocratic protection, she was force-fed 8 times in 3 days. The experience permanently damaged her health. She had a stroke in 1912 at age 43 and never fully recovered. She essentially destroyed her health to prove that the government was treating working-class women more brutally than aristocratic ones. That's commitment to a cause that borders on martyrdom. And it makes you wonder, what was it about this movement that inspired such extreme devotion? What did these women see that made them willing to suffer so much? I think part of it was that they'd glimpsed something bigger than themselves. They weren't just fighting for the vote. Though the vote was crucial was the concrete goal. They were fighting for the recognition of their full humanity, for the right to be seen as people rather than property. And once you understand that you're fighting for your basic human dignity, compromise becomes impossible. You can't meet in the middle between you're fully human and you're not quite human. There is no middle ground there. The movement also created an incredible sense of community. These women became sisters in arms. They trained together, yes, literally trained in self-defense and in how to resist police officers trying to remove them from protests. They created a bodyguard unit of women who knew jiu-jitsu and would physically protect the leaders from arrest. They developed their own newspapers, their own social networks, their own support systems. Many of them had been isolated in their normal lives, trapped in unhappy marriages or living with disapproving families. The WSPU gave them purpose, identity, belonging. There are love letters between suffragettes that survive from this period, and they're intense. The language is passionate, devoted, all-consuming. You are my dearest friend, my truest companion, my reason for fighting. Some of these were romantic relationships. Yes, there were lesbian relationships within the suffragette movement, though they couldn't be openly acknowledged at the time. But even the platonic friendships had this quality of deep, soul-level connection. These women saw each other. They validated each other's anger, their ambition, their refusal to accept limitation. And that validation was intoxicating. But the movement was also fractured. This is important to understand. It wasn't one unified force. Emmeline Pankhurst ran the WSPU with an iron fist. Her word was law. If you disagreed with her tactics or her leadership, you were expelled. Several major figures split off to form their own organisations. Even her own daughter Sylvia was expelled in 1914 because she insisted on connecting women's suffrage to broader socialist causes, and Emmeline wanted to keep the focus purely on votes for women. The constitutional suffragists, led by Millicent Fawcett, continued their peaceful lobbying and were often horrified by the militants' tactics. They worried, probably correctly, that the violence was turning public opinion against the cause, that people who might have been sympathetic to women's suffrage were now associating it with vandalism and terrorism. And within the WSPU itself, there were debates about how far to go. Not every member supported the bombing campaigns. Many were uncomfortable with the escalating violence but felt trapped. If they spoke up, they'd be accused of betraying the cause, of not being committed enough. The pressure to prove your devotion through increasingly extreme acts created its own problems. But despite the internal conflicts, despite the public backlash, despite the torture in prisons, the suffragettes kept fighting. They kept disrupting, kept protesting, kept making themselves impossible to ignore. And by 1910, 1911, they'd achieved something remarkable. They'd made women's suffrage a major political issue. It was debated in Parliament. It was front-page news. Everyone had an opinion about it. They hadn't won yet, but they'd made winning possible. They'd changed the conversation from should women vote to when will women get the vote? And that shift, that reframing was everything. But then, in 1913, something happened that would crystallize the entire movement into a single, devastating image. An image that would haunt the nation and become the defining symbol of suffragette sacrifice. And that story, the story of Emily Davison and what she did at the Derby, and what it meant and whether it was heroism or tragedy or both, that's where we're heading next. Because sometimes history hinges on a single moment, a single choice, a single woman stepping in front of a horse. There's film footage of what happened. Grainy, black and white, silent. But it exists, and once you've seen it, you can never quite forget it. June 4th, 1913. The Epsom Derby, one of the most prestigious horse races in England. The kind of event where everyone who's anyone in British society shows up. King George V is there with Queen Mary. Thousands of spectators line the track, dressed in their finest. It's a warm, sunny day. The horses thunder around the final turn, heading toward the finish line, and then, suddenly, a woman ducks under the railing and runs onto the track. Her name is Emily Wilding Davison. She's 40 years old, a university-educated suffragette who's been arrested 9 times, force-fed 49 times. And in the 2 or 3 seconds before she reaches the horses, there's this moment. You can see it in the footage if you look carefully, where she seems to hesitate. Not like she's changed her mind, but like she's gathering her courage. And then she steps directly into the path of the king's horse, a colt named Anma. The impact is devastating. The horse hits her at full gallop. She's thrown into the air. The jockey is thrown as well. The horse goes down, rolling, barely missing the jockey with its hooves, and Emily lies motionless on the track while chaos erupts around her. She never regained consciousness. She died 4 days later from a fractured skull and internal injuries. She was 40 years old, and the question that has haunted historians ever since is, why? What exactly was she trying to do? For years, the accepted narrative was that Emily Davison was a martyr who deliberately killed herself for the cause, that she committed suicide in the most public, dramatic way possible to draw attention to women's suffrage. Her funeral certainly supported that interpretation. 50,000 suffragettes marched in her funeral procession through London, wearing white and purple and green, the suffragette colours. It was the largest political funeral Britain had ever seen. Emily became a symbol, a saint, proof of the suffragettes' absolute commitment. But here's where it gets complicated, because when they collected her belongings after the incident, they found a return train ticket from Epsom in her pocket, and tickets to a suffragette social event scheduled for later that week. You don't buy a return ticket if you're planning to die. You don't make plans for next week. So what was she actually trying to do? Modern analysis of the film footage suggests she might have been attempting to attach a suffragette banner or scarf to the King's horse. A symbolic protest, a spectacular stunt meant to create headlines without causing serious harm. Several suffragettes had done similar things before at public events, trying to drape banners over horses or royal carriages. It was dangerous, yes, but not necessarily suicidal. The problem was timing. She couldn't see which horse was which until they were almost on top of her, and she couldn't have anticipated how fast they'd be moving at that point in the race, how little time she'd have to react. It's possible, maybe even probable, that she meant to do something dramatic but survivable, and it went catastrophically wrong. But you know what? In some ways, the ambiguity makes it more powerful. Because whether Emily Davison meant to die or not, she was willing to risk her life for this cause. She walked onto that track knowing she might be killed, and she did it anyway. That's not martyrdom in the traditional sense, but it's something just as significant. It's the willingness to put your body on the line, literally, for what you believe in. And the suffragette movement used her death brilliantly. They gave her a funeral that was part political demonstration, part religious procession. The coffin was covered in purple, white and green. Women walked behind it in formation carrying banners. She died for women, the banners read. Greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. A direct quote from the Bible positioning Emily as a Christ-like figure who sacrificed herself for others. The establishment was horrified, not just by Emily's death, but by the spectacle of the funeral. Here were thousands of women publicly mourning someone they considered a criminal, a terrorist, turning her into a hero. The newspapers didn't know what to do with it. Some called Emily insane, said she was mentally unstable and her death was tragic but meaningless. Others called her a fanatic whose death should serve as a warning about the dangers of the suffragette movement. But they couldn't ignore it. The story dominated the headlines for weeks. And that was the point, wasn't it? Whether Emily meant to die or not, her death did what years of protests and window smashing couldn't quite accomplish. It made the suffragettes impossible to dismiss as hysterical women throwing tantrums. This was serious. This was a woman who believed in something so deeply that she was willing to die for it. You might disagree with her methods, you might think she was wrong, but you couldn't pretend this was trivial anymore. But let's zoom out for a moment, because I want to talk about what was happening in the broader culture during this same period, roughly 1910 to 1913. Because while the suffragettes were making headlines of their militant tactics, something else was happening in the background. Edwardian society was reaching its absolute peak of extravagance. And I mean extravagance in a way that's almost hard to believe. Remember, This is a time of peace and prosperity for the upper classes. The British Empire is at its height. The economy is strong. Technology is advancing. Cars, telephones, electric lights are becoming common in wealthy homes. And the aristocracy and newly rich industrialists are spending money like there's no tomorrow, which, in a way, there wasn't, but they didn't know that yet. Fashion in this period becomes almost cartoonishly elaborate. We talked about the S-bend corset before, but by 1910, fashion is moving in an even more extreme direction. Enter the hobble skirt. The hobble skirt was exactly what it sounds like. A skirt so narrow at the ankles that women could only take tiny shuffling steps. You literally couldn't walk normally in one. You were hobbled, like a horse that's been tied up so it can't run away. The skirt was usually slightly shorter than previous styles, maybe showing your ankles scandalous, but so tight that you had to take steps of maybe 6 inches at a time. Some versions even had a little strap sewn inside the hem that you'd loop around your legs to keep the skirt from splitting when you tried to walk. It was designed by Paul Poiret, the French designer, though he later denied wanting to take credit for it because it became so ridiculed. And here's what's insane. Women actually wore these. Fashionable women in 1910 and 1911 would hobble around in these skirts that made it nearly impossible to walk, let alone run or climb stairs. There are newspaper reports of women falling over in hobble skirts because they couldn't catch themselves. One woman in Paris famously broke her ankle because she couldn't move quickly enough to avoid a cyclist. Why would anyone wear something so impractical? Fashion, obviously, but also, I think there's something psychological happening here. The hobble skirt was the absolute extreme of ornamental femininity. You were so decorative, so refined, so far removed from any practical purpose that you literally couldn't move efficiently. You were a living work of art, and for women who had no other way to assert their value, who'd been raised to believe their worth lay in their beauty and elegance, maybe that felt empowering in its own weird way. But the hobble skirt also became a symbol of everything the suffragettes were fighting against. Here you had women literally hobbling themselves for fashion, while other women were being force-fed in prison for demanding basic rights. The contrast was stark, and suffragettes and their supporters started using the hobble skirt as ammunition in their arguments. Look at how society treats women like ornaments, like pets, restricting their movement, making them helpless. This is exactly why we need the vote, to free ourselves from being decorative objects. Meanwhile, hats were getting larger, and I mean genuinely absurdly large. By 1910, fashionable hats could be 2 or 3 feet wide, decorated with entire taxidermied birds, mountains of feathers, ribbons, artificial flowers, sometimes even fruit. Women wearing these hats couldn't fit through doorways without turning sideways. They had to reserve special seats at theatres because their hats blocked everyone's view. There was a genuine movement to ban large hats from theatres and public transportation because they were such a nuisance. And again, you have to ask, why? Why would women wear hats so large they could barely function? Partly it was competition, the one-upmanship of fashion, seeing who could have the most elaborate hat. But it was also display. The hat announced your wealth, your leisure, your social status. A hat like that was expensive. It required servants to help you put it on and take it off. It meant you didn't do any physical labour because you couldn't in that hat. It was a wearable billboard saying, "I am wealthy and idle and ornamental." So you have this bizarre situation where wealthy women are hobbling around in restrictive skirts and enormous hats, literally unable to move efficiently, while working class and middle class suffragettes are learning jiu-jitsu and chaining themselves to railings and running onto racetracks. 2 completely different visions of what womanhood could be, existing simultaneously in the same society. And here's what's fascinating. Some women were living in both worlds. Remember, not all suffragettes was working class. Some of them were wealthy, fashionable women who would wear a hobble skirt to a garden party in the afternoon and attend a suffragette meeting in the evening. They understood that fashion was a language, and they spoke it fluently. They could play the role of decorative lady when needed, and then transform into political activist when the situation called for it. There's this amazing photograph from 1911 of a suffragette march in London. Thousands of women, all dressed impeccably. Long skirts, elegant hats, parasols. They look like they're going to a society event, but they're marching, holding banners, demanding the vote. The visual message was powerful. We are respectable women. We are your mothers, your wives, your daughters. We are not wild-eyed radicals or unwomanly harridans. We are ladies, and we demand our rights. The establishment hated this because it disrupted their narrative. They wanted to portray suffragettes as unfeminine, unattractive women who wanted the vote because they couldn't get husbands. But here were beautiful, fashionable, clearly feminine women demanding political power. It didn't fit the stereotype. It made people uncomfortable, and the suffragettes used this strategically. When they were arrested, they'd dress in white, the colour of purity and innocence. When they posed for photographs, they'd arrange themselves beautifully, looking poised and dignified. They understood public relations in a way that was ahead of their time. They were fighting not just a political battle, but a cultural one, trying to change how people thought about women's capabilities and women's rights. But by 1913, the movement was becoming increasingly fractured and desperate. The militant tactics weren't working fast enough. Parliament still hadn't granted women the vote. The force-feeding continued. Some suffragettes were in prison so often they barely spent any time at home. The toll on their health, both physical and mental, was enormous, and the public was getting tired of the disruption. Support for women's suffrage was actually declining in some polls because people associated it with violence and vandalism. Emmeline Pankhurst was becoming more autocratic, more extreme in her demands. She'd expelled anyone who questioned her leadership. The movement that had started with such hope and energy in 1903 was by 1913 starting to fragment and exhaust itself. They'd achieved so much. They'd made women's suffrage a national conversation. They'd proved that women could organise and fight. But they still hadn't won the vote. And it wasn't clear if they ever would, not through these tactics. And then something unexpected happened. Something no one could have predicted that would change absolutely everything. Not just for the suffragettes, not just for women, but for the entire world. It was building quietly in the background all through this period we've been discussing. Political tensions, military alliances, imperial rivalries, and in the summer of 1914, all of those tensions would explode into catastrophe. The world that the suffragettes were fighting to change, the world of elegant garden parties and elaborate fashion and rigid social hierarchies, it was about to end, completely, violently, irrevocably. But before we get to that devastating summer, we need to talk about one more thing. The last gasp, the final moment of peak Edwardian excess, the absolute pinnacle of that beautiful doomed world. Because in the months before everything collapsed, there was this strange sense of intensity, like everyone somehow knew deep down that this couldn't last, that they were living in borrowed time, and so they partied harder, dressed more extravagantly, squeezed every last drop of pleasure out of a world that was already starting to crumble at the edges. And what that looked like, what those final months of peace felt like for the women living through them, that's where we're going next. If you could step into a time machine and visit the summer of 1913, not 1914 yet, but the summer before everything ended, you'd notice something strange in the air. Not visible exactly, but palpable. It's there in the photographs, in the diaries, in the letters people wrote. A kind of feverish intensity. a desperate quality to the pleasure-seeking, like everyone was trying to drink in as much beauty and luxury and joy as they possibly could, as if they somehow sensed that time was running out. Of course, they didn't consciously know what was coming. How could they? But there was this undercurrent of anxiety that people couldn't quite name, political tensions across Europe, industrial strikes at home, the Irish question getting more violent, the suffragettes setting fires, and underneath it all, this nagging sense that the old order, the hierarchies and certainties that had structured their entire world, was starting to crack. So they parted. Oh, how they parted. The London season of 1913 was perhaps the most extravagant in history. There's a wonderful memoir by Lady Diana Cooper, who was a young debutante that year, and she describes it as a last burst of splendour before the darkness. The balls, the dinners, the garden parties, everything was bigger, more lavish, more excessive than ever before. It was as if the aristocracy had collectively decided that if their world was going to end, though they didn't phrase it that way, of course, they were going to go out in a blaze of glory. Let me paint you a picture of what a truly grand ball looked like in this period, because the scale of it is hard to fathom today. The hostess, and it was always the lady of the house who organised these things, with the help of an army of servants, would spend months planning. The invitations alone were works of art handwritten on thick cream paper delivered by servants. You'd invite anywhere from 200 to 500 guests. The house would be transformed. Every room would be decorated with thousands of flowers, roses, orchids, lilies, all hothouse grown and outrageously expensive. The ballroom would be lit by hundreds of candles in crystal chandeliers, because electric light was considered too harsh, too modern. Candles gave that soft, flattering glow that made everyone look beautiful. The guests would arrive in their finest. Women in gowns that cost what a servant earned in 5 years. These weren't simple dresses. They were constructions of silk and satin and lace, hand-embroidered with beads and crystals, taking weeks or months to make. The trains alone could be 6 feet long. And the jewels, oh, the jewels! Tiaras, necklaces, bracelets, brooches, diamonds, sapphires, emeralds, all real, all inherited or purchased at astronomical cost. Every woman was essentially wearing her family's entire fortune on her body, and the food. Tables would groan under the weight of elaborate dishes, not just quantity but artistry. Sculptures made of spun sugar, ice swans, whole decorated salmons, towers of pastries. The supper wouldn't be served until midnight, but there would be constant champagne flowing all evening. The band, a full orchestra, not some small ensemble, would play waltzes and foxtrots. People would dance for hours, the women's skirts swirling, the candlelight catching on the jewels, creating this atmosphere of almost magical opulence. And here's what strikes me. The servants who made all of this possible. Think about the labour involved. The housemaids who spent days polishing silver and crystal. The footmen who served champagne for 6 hours straight, standing at attention, never allowed to show fatigue. The kitchen staff who prepared elaborate dishes for 500 people, working 18-hour shifts in sweltering basement kitchens. The ladies' maids who dressed their mistresses in those complex gowns, fixing their hair, repairing any damage to the clothes throughout the evening. These servants couldn't afford to feed their own families properly, but they were creating feast for people who'd barely notice if a dish was missing. They lived in cramped, cold attic rooms, but they maintained houses with 30 bedrooms. They had no leisure, no freedom, no prospect of changing their circumstances, and they watched their employers live like this. Like wealth and beauty and pleasure were infinite, were deserved, were the natural order of things. You have to wonder what they thought. Some of them probably internalized the system, believed that the aristocracy really was superior, that this was how God intended the world to be ordered. But others must have felt the injustice of it like a physical weight, must have gone to their tiny rooms at 2 a.m. after cleaning up from a party where more food was wasted than they'd eat in a month, and thought, this cannot last. This should not last. And they were right, but in the summer of 1913 it still seemed eternal. Now let's talk about what was happening economically, because this is crucial to understanding why the whole system was actually collapsing even as it looked most secure. The aristocracy was quietly going broke. Remember, aristocratic wealth was based on land. You owned vast estates, and tenant farmers paid rent to work that land, and that rent income supported your lifestyle. But agricultural prices had been falling for decades. American and Australian grain was cheaper than British grain because of improvements in transportation and refrigeration. Tenant farmers were struggling to pay rent. Some estates that had been profitable for centuries were now losing money. Meanwhile, the expenses of maintaining an aristocratic lifestyle were skyrocketing. Those balls we just talked about? Ruinously expensive. Running a country estate with dozens of servants, extraordinarily costly. Keeping up appearances, because you had to keep up appearances or you'd lose your social position, meant spending money you might not actually have. And then there were the death duties. In 1894, and then more severely in 1909 with Lloyd George's People's Budget, the government had introduced estate taxes. When an aristocrat died, a significant percentage of the estate's value, sometimes up to 40%, had to be paid in taxes. This was devastating. Families who'd held land for 500 years suddenly had to sell parcels of it to pay the tax bill. The great estates were being broken up piece by piece. So by 1913, many aristocratic families were in this desperate situation where they looked wealthy but were actually drowning in debt. They had the houses, the titles, the clothes, the jewels, but they didn't have cash. They were asset-rich and cash-poor, and the assets were depreciating. This is why those marriages between old-money aristocracy and new-money industrialists became even more common in this period. It wasn't just about social climbing anymore. It was about survival. The aristocrats needed the industrialists' cash to save their estates, and the industrialists wanted the social legitimacy that titles provided. It was a transaction, usually unhappy for both parties but increasingly necessary. There's a heartbreaking diary entry from Lady Cynthia Asquith, daughter-in-law of the Prime Minister, written in 1913. She's describing a dinner party where everyone is pretending to be fine, but she knows that at least 3 of the families present are in serious financial trouble. She writes something like, "We're all acting in a play where everyone knows their lines, but the theatre is on fire and we're pretending not to smell the smoke." That's such a perfect metaphor for the whole era, isn't it? The theatre is on fire, but the show must go on. And yet even as the old system was crumbling, there was still this incredible resistance to change. The aristocracy controlled Parliament. The House of Lords was entirely hereditary peers, men who'd inherited their seats. They could block any legislation they didn't like, and they used that power to try to prevent reforms that would have helped ordinary people but threatened aristocratic privilege. When Lloyd George tried to pass his People's Budget in 1909, which would have increased taxes on the wealthy to fund old age pensions and unemployment insurance for working people, the House of Lords tried to block it. This created a constitutional crisis. Eventually, the king threatened to create hundreds of new Liberal peers to override the Conservative Lords, and they backed down. But the resistance was fierce, bitter, desperate, because they knew, on some level, they knew that every concession to democracy, every expansion of voting rights, every social welfare program was a step toward the end of their dominance. And they were right. But they couldn't stop it. The momentum was too strong. Now let's shift perspective and talk about what this period looked like for the emerging middle class, because their experience was completely different and absolutely crucial to understanding the changes happening in society. The middle class was growing rapidly. Industrialization, modern commerce, the expansion of professional services, all of this created a huge demand for educated, skilled workers. Clerks, managers, accountants, engineers, teachers, nurses. These were respectable jobs that paid decent salaries and allowed families to live comfortably, if not luxuriously. And crucially, the middle class was aspirational. They wanted to move up. They wanted their children to have more opportunities than they'd had. Education became hugely important. Secondary schools were expanding, universities were becoming more accessible. The middle class was starting to believe that merit and hard work could overcome the accidents of birth, which was a revolutionary idea in a society that had been based on hereditary privilege for centuries. Middle-class women in particular were pushing boundaries in fascinating ways. They couldn't have the elaborate idleness of aristocratic ladies. Most middle-class families couldn't afford to keep an adult daughter at home doing nothing. So middle-class girls were getting educated, training for professions. They were becoming teachers, nurses, secretaries, shopgirls. And this created a model of a female independence that was completely different from the aristocratic ideal. There's a wonderful novel from this period called The Getting of Wisdom by Henry Handel Richardson, actually published in 1910, so right in our time frame, that captures this perfectly. It's about a middle-class Australian girl navigating the changing expectations of womanhood. Should she be decorative and marriageable, or educated and independent? Can she be both? The novel doesn't provide easy answers, but it asks the right questions, and middle-class women were also becoming consumers in a new way. Department stores were exploding in popularity in this period. Harrods, Selfridges in London, Macy's, Marshall Field's in America. These weren't just shops, they were palaces of consumption, designed to make shopping itself a pleasurable experience. They had restaurants where women could have lunch unchaperoned, reading rooms, art galleries. They were social spaces where women could spend time, could be seen, could participate in public life in a way that had previously been difficult. The marketing of this period is fascinating because it's the birth of modern advertising. Companies were learning to sell not just products but lifestyles, identities. Ads would show women that if they bought this soap or that hat or this particular brand of tea, they could be elegant, modern, sophisticated. They could embody a certain kind of femininity. It was manipulative, absolutely, but it also gave women agency as consumers. They could make choices about what to buy. It was a form of power in a world where they had very few other forms of power. But there was darkness in this commercial expansion too. The clothes being sold in those beautiful department stores, often made in sweatshops by women and children working in terrible conditions for pennies. The Industrial Revolution had created enormous wealth, but it had also created enormous exploitation. And most middle-class consumers didn't want to think about that. It was easier to enjoy the beautiful clothes and pretend ignorance about where they came from. There was a growing labour movement trying to address these injustices. Trade unions were organising, strikes were becoming more common and more confrontational. In 1911 and 1912, there were massive strikes by railway workers, dock workers, coal miners. Some of them turned violent. The government sometimes deployed military troops to break strikes, which led to deaths. The working class was demanding better wages, better conditions, recognition of their human dignity, and the establishment was pushing back hard. So you have this situation where society is being pulled in multiple directions simultaneously. The aristocracy is trying to maintain their traditional dominance even as they're going broke. The middle class is expanding and demanding more opportunity and recognition. The working class is organising and striking for basic rights. Women across all classes are pushing for suffrage and greater freedom. And all of these tensions are building. And then there's technology, which was changing everything faster than society could adapt. Think about what was invented or became widespread just in the decade before World War I. Automobiles became common among the wealthy, which changed patterns of social life. You could drive yourself places instead of depending on trains and carriages. Telephones meant instant communication across distances. Electric lights changed the rhythm of daily life. You could work or socialize after dark without the limitations of candles and gas lamps. X-rays were revolutionizing medicine. Airplanes, actual flying machines, had gone from impossible fantasy to reality in just a few years. The pace of change was disorienting. If you were born in 1850, you'd grown up in a world of horses and letters that took weeks to arrive. By 1913, you were living in a world of cars and telephones and moving pictures. Your grandchildren were reading about airplanes and radio waves. The future was arriving faster than anyone could process. And I think this technological acceleration created a psychological pressure that people felt but couldn't articulate. The old certainties about class, about gender roles, about how society should be organized, didn't fit the new reality. But creating new certainties, new social structures that matched the new technology, that was harder, messier, more frightening. So people clung to tradition even more fiercely, or they rejected it even more radically. The moderates, the people who wanted gradual, measured change, were losing influence. Society was polarizing, and polarization makes compromise impossible, makes conflict inevitable. There's this photograph I've seen from a garden party in the summer of 1913. It's at some great estate, and there are maybe 50 people visible in the frame. The women in elaborate white dresses and enormous hats, the men in morning suits. They're scattered across a perfect lawn, with the manor house in the background. Some are playing croquet. Some are sitting at tables having tea. It looks idyllic, timeless, like a painting of paradise. But if you know the context, if you know about the strikes and the suffragettes and the death duties and the agricultural depression and the arms race building across Europe, you look at that photograph differently. You see people trying desperately to pretend that everything is fine, that this beautiful world will continue forever. You see them arranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Because there's one more thing we haven't talked about yet. One more pressure building in the background that almost nobody was paying attention to in the summer of 1913. The political situation in Europe. The network of military alliances that meant if one country went to war, everyone would be dragged in. The arms race between Britain and Germany, both countries building massive fleets of warships. The tensions in the Balkans, where nationalist movements were threatening the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The various European powers jockeying for colonial possessions in Africa and Asia, creating friction and resentment. Most people weren't thinking about any of this. International politics seemed distant, irrelevant to daily life. The last major European war had been almost 50 years ago, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 71. That was ancient history to someone in 1913. The assumption was that modern civilized nations didn't go to war anymore. Trade had made everyone too interconnected. The costs would be too high, and if there were a war, it would be short. A few months at most, then everyone would negotiate and go home. This assumption was so universal, so deeply believed, that almost no one prepared for the alternative. The British Army in 1914 was tiny, maybe 250,000 men, mostly deployed in colonial territories. Germany and France had much larger armies, but they were designed for quick, decisive victories, not prolonged conflict. Nobody had stockpiled supplies for a war lasting years. Nobody had thought about how to feed civilians if trade routes were disrupted. Nobody had imagined the kind of industrial-scale slaughter that modern weapons could produce. The suffragettes weren't thinking about war. They were focused on their political battle. The aristocrats partying through the 1913 season weren't thinking about war. They were focused on maintaining their lifestyle and social position. The middle-class families weren't thinking about war. They were focused on education and advancement. The workers on strike weren't thinking about war. They were focused on wages and conditions. Everyone was looking at their immediate concerns, their personal struggles. And while they were looking down, history was building a tidal wave that was about to crash over all of them. But we're not quite there yet. There's still one more season to get through. The summer of 1914, the last summer, when everything that had been building would finally, catastrophically explode, when a single assassination in a distant city would trigger a chain of events that would kill millions and destroy the world we've been describing completely. When all those elegant women in their elaborate dresses, all those aristocratic families in their great houses, all those certainties about class and gender and how society should work would be swept away in 4 years of mechanized horror that nobody saw coming. But before we get to that moment, before the assassination, before the declarations of war, before the world catches fire, we need to understand what these women thought was happening, what their plans were, what they hoped for in that last precious summer before everything ended, because they didn't know, couldn't know, that they were living in the final moments of a world that would never exist again. There's a specific quality to the light in early summer. June light, particularly in northern Europe, has this golden extended quality. The sun stays up until 10 at night, and twilight seems to last for hours. And in the summer of 1914, that long golden light illuminated what would be remembered as the most beautiful, most tragic season in British history. Nobody knew it was the last. That's the heartbreaking part. They thought it was just another summer. The season began in May, as it always did. Young women who'd been presented at court in the spring now made their rounds of balls, garden parties, and country house weekends. The same rituals, the same elaborate dresses, the same careful dance of courtship and social positioning. If you were there, you might have noticed that champagne seemed to flow a bit more freely than usual, that the parties went a bit later into the night, that people laughed perhaps a bit too loudly, as if trying to convince themselves that everything was fine. But mostly, if you were there, you would have noticed nothing unusual at all. Just another season. Just another round of pleasure and privilege and the endless, exhausting work of maintaining your place in the social hierarchy. Let me tell you about Vera Brittain, because her story captures something essential about this moment. Vera was 20 years old in the summer of 1914, the daughter of a wealthy paper manufacturer, new money, but respectable new money. She'd fought with her parents for permission to take the entrance exams for Oxford University. This was radical. Only a tiny number of women attended university at all, and most families thought it was unnecessary, even dangerous. Education would make girls unmarriageable, they believed. It would give them ideas. But Vera was determined, brilliant, and stubborn. She'd taken the exams in December 1913 and passed. She'd be starting at Somerville College, Oxford, in October 1914. The summer of 1914 was supposed to be her last season of relative freedom before the serious work of university began. She kept a diary, which she later published, and reading it is like watching someone stand on train tracks, unaware of the approaching locomotive. June 1914. She writes about garden parties, about a young man named Roland Leighton who's caught her interest. He's brilliant, poetic, going to Oxford himself. She writes about tennis parties and long walks and conversations about literature and philosophy. She writes about the suffragettes, who she admires but finds a bit too militant for her taste. She writes about her excitement for Oxford, her nervousness about whether she'll be accepted by the other students, whether she's truly intelligent enough. She doesn't write about politics. She doesn't write about Europe. Why would she? That's men's business, distant and abstract and irrelevant to her daily life. June 28, 1914, a Sunday. Vera Brittain is at a tennis party. Roland Leighton is there. They're flirting in that careful, proper way that young Edwardian people flirted. Nothing overt, nothing scandalous. Just meaningful glances and conversations about poetry that are really about something else entirely. It's a perfect English summer day. The sun is warm, the grass is green, everything feels possible. And on that same day, in Sarajevo, a city most British people couldn't find on a map, a 19-year-old Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip shoots and kills Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria and his wife Sophie. The news reaches Britain over the next few days, but it's not front-page news everywhere. It's in the papers, certainly. An assassination is dramatic, but it's positioned as a tragedy in a volatile region, not as anything that would affect Britain directly. The Balkans were always having some kind of crisis. This seemed like just another one. The season continued. The parties didn't stop. Why would they? An archduke had been killed in some far-off place. Terrible, certainly, but not relevant to whether Lady So-and-so's ball would be well attended or whether the Henley Regatta would be a success. July proceeded as July always did. Ascot races. The King and Queen attended, everyone wore their finest, the same pageantry as every year. Wimbledon Tennis Championships, Henley Royal Regatta, where wealthy families kept houseboats on the Thames and watched rowing races while drinking champagne. Cricket at Lord's. All the rituals of the British summer, each one reinforcing the message: we are civilized, we are stable, we are eternal. But behind the scenes, diplomats were working frantically. Austria-Hungary was demanding concessions from Serbia over the assassination. Serbia was refusing. Russia was pledging to support Serbia. Germany was pledging to support Austria-Hungary. France had an alliance with Russia. Britain had commitments to France. The network of alliances that was supposed to keep the peace through mutual deterrence was instead creating a situation where one spark could set everything on fire. And still, most people weren't paying attention. There's a fascinating phenomenon in history where the people living through momentous events often don't realize their significance until much later. If you'd asked someone at a garden party in mid-July 1914 what they thought the most important issue facing Britain was, they probably would have said the Irish Home Rule question, or the suffragettes or labour strikes. Not some diplomatic crisis in the Balkans. But a few people were paying attention. Politicians, military leaders, journalists who specialised in foreign affairs, they were watching the diplomatic exchanges with growing alarm. And some of them were starting to realise that this time might be different, that the usual diplomatic solutions might not work, that the machinery of war, once it started moving, might be impossible to stop. July 23rd, Austria-Hungary sends an ultimatum to Serbia. The terms are deliberately harsh, designed to be rejected. This is the moment when people who understand European politics start to get genuinely frightened. An ultimatum means Austria's looking for an excuse to go to war with Serbia. And if they do, Russia will intervene. And if Russia intervenes, Germany will intervene. And then France. And then... But even then, even with the ultimatum, most British people were still going about their normal summer activities. The cognitive dissonance is striking. You have diplomats working around the clock, increasingly panicked, knowing they're watching a catastrophe unfold in slow motion. And you have aristocratic families planning their August grouse shooting trips to Scotland, completely unconcerned. Vera Brittain in her diary, July 24th, still writing about Roland Leighton, about preparations for Oxford, about a conversation with her mother about what dresses she'll need for university. No mention of Serbia, no mention of Austria. The crisis might as well not exist. July 28th. Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. This is it. This is the point of no return. Russia begins mobilizing its army. Germany demands that Russia stop mobilization, knowing full well they won't. It's all happening exactly as the pessimists feared. The dominoes are falling. And in Britain, the last week of July was supposed to be the climax of the season, some of the most important social events of the year, and they were still happening. People were still sending out invitations, still planning menus, still worrying about whether their dress was fashionable enough. There's a memoir by Lady Cynthia Asquith, we've mentioned her before, about this specific week. She's the daughter-in-law of Prime Minister Herbert Asquith, so she's more aware than most people of what's happening politically. And she describes this surreal experience of going to parties where half the guests are discussing politics in hushed, worried voices, and the other half are cheerfully oblivious, chatting about fashion and gossip as if nothing unusual's happening at all. She describes one particular dinner party on July 30th. This is 2 days before Britain would enter the war, where she's sitting next to a young aristocrat who's complaining about how difficult it is to find good servants anymore, how the lower classes are getting so demanding with their unions and their strikes. And Cynthia is thinking, we might be at war in 48 hours. Thousands of men might die. And this person is worried about servant problems. But can you blame him? He'd lived his entire life in a world where servants were the most pressing concern a wealthy person had to deal with. The idea that his world was about to be completely upended was literally unthinkable. His brain couldn't process it, so he defaulted to what he knew, complaining about servants. August 1st, Germany declares war on Russia. France begins mobilizing. Britain is technically not involved yet. There's no direct treaty requiring British intervention at this point. There's an emergency cabinet meeting. Some ministers want to stay neutral. Others argue that Britain has to support France. The Prime Minister is agonizing over the decision, and the suffragettes, incredibly, call a truce. Emmeline Pankhurst announces that the WSPU is suspending all militant activities for the duration of the crisis. This is extraordinary. These women have been fighting, going to prison, being force-fed, setting fires, and now suddenly they're saying, national unity is more important. We'll fight for the vote later. Right now, we're British first and suffragettes second. Not all suffragettes agree with this decision, by the way. Sylvia Pankhurst, Emmeline's daughter, who'd already been expelled from the WSPU, argues that the war is an imperialist conflict that working-class people shouldn't support. She'd be proven right about the nature of the war, but she's in the minority. Most suffragettes, like most British people, get swept up in the patriotic fervour. August 3rd. Germany invades Belgium. Belgium is neutral. Its neutrality is guaranteed by treaty, including by Britain. This changes everything. Now it's not just about supporting France or about distant alliances. It's about defending a small neutral country from invasion. It's about honour, about treaty obligations, about standing up to aggression. The British government delivers an ultimatum to Germany. Withdraw from Belgium or Britain will declare war. The deadline is midnight British time on August 4th. And suddenly everyone is paying attention. Suddenly the diplomatic crisis that had seemed abstract and distant is immediate and real. Britain might be going to war. British men might be sent to fight. And everyone who'd been obliviously planning their grouse shooting trips is forced to confront the possibility that their entire world is about to change. August 4th, 1914. The day everything ended. The deadline passes. Germany hasn't withdrawn from Belgium. At 11 p.m. British time, midnight in Germany, Britain formally declares war. There are crowds in the streets of London, thousands of people gathered outside Buckingham Palace, outside Parliament, in Trafalgar Square, and they're cheering, actually cheering, waving flags, singing patriotic songs. The atmosphere is described as festive, excited, almost euphoric. This seems insane to us now, knowing what's coming, but you have to understand the mindset. Most people thought the war would be short. Over by Christmas was the common phrase. They thought it would be glorious, an adventure. Young men were excited to prove their bravery, to be part of something historically significant. The recruiting offices were overwhelmed with volunteers in these first weeks. Men queuing for hours to enlist, afraid the war might end before they got their chance to fight. And the women's reactions were complex and varied. Some were caught up in the patriotic fervour, encouraging men to enlist, participating in the war effort. Others were terrified for their brothers, their sweethearts, their husbands. Some saw opportunity. If men were going to war, women would have to fill the jobs they left behind. Finally, a chance to prove what women could do. Vera Britton's diary, August 4th. I don't know what to feel. Roland is talking about enlisting. Part of me is terrified, part of me is proud, part of me can't believe this is real. Yesterday we were planning our future at Oxford. Today everything is uncertain. Roland Leighton did enlist. He was commissioned as an officer. He was killed in France in December 1915, one of millions. Vera would spend the war years as a nurse, tending to wounded soldiers, watching young men die. Her brother, her fiancé, most of her close male friends, all killed in the war. She'd write about it later in her memoir, Testament of Youth, one of the most powerful accounts of what the war did to her generation. But in August 1914, none of that had happened yet. In August 1914, there was still hope, still the belief that civilization would prevail, that modern nations couldn't really slaughter each other wholesale, that common sense would eventually win out. They were so wrong, so tragically, devastatingly wrong. The season ended abruptly. Balls were cancelled. House parties were called off. Families who'd been planning to spend August in Scotland changed their plans. It seemed frivolous to be on holiday when the nation was at war. The social machinery that had run so smoothly for so long simply stopped, and the women in their elaborate dresses, the queens of elegance who'd ruled the social world with such confidence. What happened to them? Some of them clung to the old ways, tried to pretend nothing had changed, insisted on maintaining standards and proprieties even as the world burned. Others transformed themselves almost overnight, became nurses, ambulance drivers, factory workers, took on roles that would have been scandalous, unthinkable just months before. The war that everyone thought would be over by Christmas lasted 4 years. 4 years of mechanized slaughter on a scale that humanity had never seen before. Machine guns, artillery, poison gas, tanks, airplanes dropping bombs, modern technology applied to the ancient human impulse to kill each other. The Battle of the Somme in July 1916 produced 60,000 British casualties on the first day. The first day. More men killed or wounded in one day than in some entire previous wars. An entire generation of young men was destroyed. The aristocratic families who sent their sons off to be officers suffered particularly severe losses. Officers led from the front, which meant they were killed at higher rates than enlisted men. Every major family lost someone, most lost multiple people. The young men in those photographs from the summer of 1914, The ones playing cricket and tennis and looking so confident and alive. Most of them were dead within 2 years. And the women? The women who survived the war, and most women did survive, physically at least, though many were destroyed psychologically by grief. They came out of it changed. How could they not be? They'd proved they could do men's work. They'd kept the economy running while the men were fighting. They'd demonstrated courage and capability and endurance. And they'd earned something that all the pre-war protests couldn't quite achieve: respect. In 1918, when the war finally ended, Parliament passed the Representation of the People Act. Women over 30 who met certain property qualifications were given the vote. It wasn't full equality. Men could vote at 21. Women had to wait until 30. But it was a massive victory. The suffragettes had been right. They did deserve the vote. And it took a world war to prove it. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We're in August 1914, and the war is just beginning, and the women we've been following through this story, the aristocratic ladies in their corsets and their garden parties, the working girls in their tailored suits, the suffragettes who'd been fighting so hard for the vote, all of them are about to discover what they're capable of when everything they've known is stripped away, when the rules that constrained them collapse, when survival becomes more important than propriety, and what they discovered about themselves, about each other, about what women could do when given the chance, would change the world more thoroughly than any political movement could have. Because sometimes it takes complete destruction to create the possibility of something new. Sometimes the old world has to burn before a better one can rise from the ashes. And that's exactly what's about to happen. Within weeks of the war starting, something remarkable happened. Something that if you'd predicted it in July 1914, people would have laughed at you. The corsets came off. Not metaphorically, literally. Women across Britain started taking off their corsets and not putting them back on. Why? Because suddenly they had to move. They had to run. They had to work. They had to do things that were physically impossible when you were laced into a steel-boned cage that restricted your breathing and compressed your organs. And when the choice became wear a corset and be decorative, or take it off and be useful, millions of women chose useful. And once they'd experienced the freedom of breathing fully, of bending at the waist, of moving through the world without constant physical restriction, well, most of them never went back. Fashion would reflect this change, but the change came from the women themselves, from the bottom up, not from designers telling them what to wear. It was a revolution you could measure in inches around the ribcage. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's talk about what actually happened to women in the war, because it's more complex and more fascinating than the simple narrative of women went to work in factories. That happened, yes, but there was so much more. First, there were the nurses. Nursing wasn't new as a profession for women. Florence Nightingale had established that in the Crimean War 60 years earlier. But the scale of need in World War I was unprecedented. The British Army had maybe a few thousand trained nurses at the start of the war. By 1918, there were over 80,000 women working as nurses or nursing assistants, both in Britain and in field hospitals near the front lines. And this wasn't gentle, ladylike nursing. This was dealing with wounds that were more horrific than anything in medical history. Poison gas burns, shrapnel injuries, shell shock, what we'd now call PTSD, which nobody understood at the time. Young men with their faces blown off, their limbs amputated, their minds shattered. And these women, many of them from sheltered upper-class backgrounds, women who'd never seen blood before, who'd been raised to faint at anything unpleasant, they dealt with it, daily, for years. Vera Britton, who we met before, served as a voluntary aid detachment nurse, a VAD. She'd gone to Oxford for one term before volunteering to nurse in 1915. Her memoir describes washing suppurating wounds, watching young men die in agony, dealing with bodies and blood and suffering on a scale she couldn't have imagined. She describes one Christmas Eve in a military hospital where she and the other nurses worked a 12-hour shift tending to newly arrived casualties, and by the end of it, she was so covered in blood that her uniform had to be burned because it couldn't be cleaned. That's not the elegant, refined lady we talked about in earlier parts of this story. That's someone who's been forged into something else entirely by necessity and horror. And there were thousands like her. Tens of thousands. Women who transformed themselves from ornamental to essential in a matter of months. But nursing was still seen as acceptably feminine, caring for others, nurturing that fit traditional ideas about women's roles. The really revolutionary changes happened in the factories. By 1915, Britain had a crisis. The war was consuming ammunition at rates nobody had predicted. Artillery shells, bullets, grenades. The front lines were devouring them faster than the factories could produce them. And the factories didn't have enough workers because the men who'd been working there had enlisted to fight. The government was desperate. They needed workers, and the only available labour pool was women. At first, this was controversial, very controversial. The men who were still in factories, the trade unionists who'd fought for years to establish skilled labour as men's work with men's wages, they were furious. They argued that bringing in women would degrade the profession, lower wages, take jobs from men, but the government overruled them. National emergency. Women were recruited for munitions work. These women became known as munitionettes. And the work was dangerous in ways that are hard to convey. They were handling explosives, toxic chemicals, working with machinery that could kill you if you made a mistake. The yellow powder used in shells, TNT, would stain workers' skin yellow. They were called canary girls because their faces and hands would turn bright yellow from the chemical exposure. And that yellow staining, it was a sign of poisoning. Many of these women suffered from toxic jaundice, liver damage. Some died from the exposure. There was an explosion at a munitions factory in Silvertown, London, in January 1917 that killed 73 people and injured over 400, many of them women. The explosion was so powerful it was heard 100 miles away. Buildings collapsed. A fire raged for days, and the women who survived? Most of them went back to work within weeks, because the war needed shells. Soldiers were dying for lack of ammunition. What choice did they have? And here's the thing that's both inspiring and infuriating. These women were paid half what men had been paid for the same work. Half. They were doing dangerous, essential war work, risking their lives daily, and the government's position was that women's work was worth half of men's work. The justification was that women didn't have families to support, ignoring the fact that many of them did, that many working-class women were supporting children or elderly parents, especially now that their husbands or fathers were at war. But they took the jobs anyway, because the wages, even at half the male rate, were better than anything most working-class women could earn otherwise. A munitionette could make £2 or £3 per week, which was significant money. Domestic servants, which is what many of these women had been before the war, made maybe £20 per year plus room and board. So despite the danger, despite the poor pay relative to men, munitions work was actually economic advancement for working-class women. And crucially, it gave them independence. They weren't living in someone else's house, subject to someone else's rules. They could rent their own rooms, go where they wanted in their free time, wear what they wanted, make their own choices. For many women, despite the horror of the work, this period was the first time they'd experienced genuine personal freedom. There's a wonderful collection of oral histories from munitionettes recorded in the 1970s, women remembering their experiences 50 years later. And what's striking is how many of them talk about the camaraderie, the friendships, the sense of purpose. Yes, the work was terrible and dangerous. Yes, they were exploited and underpaid, but they were also needed, essential. For the first time in their lives, society couldn't function without them, and that feeling of being necessary, of mattering, was intoxicating. One woman, Carolyn Renless, remembered, "It was the best time of my life." And that sounds mad, doesn't it? We were making weapons of death. We were poisoning ourselves, but we felt important, valued, like what we did mattered. And after a lifetime of being told that women didn't matter, that feeling was worth almost any price. Of course, not all women worked in munitions. There were women driving ambulances, which was revolutionary, women driving in public, unsupervised. Women worked as bus conductors, postal workers, in offices and banks, on farms. The Land Girls program recruited women to do agricultural work, replacing farmhands who'd enlisted. This meant physical labour, ploughing fields, harvesting crops, tending livestock. Work that had been considered far too rough and masculine for women. And you know what women discovered? They could do it. They could drive. They could operate machinery. They could manage heavy physical labour. All the things society had insisted women were too delicate for turned out to be completely possible once someone actually gave them the chance to try. The Women's Army Auxiliary Corps was formed in 1917. Women serving in the military in non-combat roles. Cooks, clerks, telephone operators, drivers. They wore uniforms. They lived in military barracks. They were subject to military discipline. This was unprecedented. Women in the army, not as nurses, but as soldiers. Well, auxiliaries. They weren't armed, but still. The symbolism was enormous. And then there were the women who didn't transform themselves, who tried to maintain the old standards. The aristocratic ladies who continued to host charity balls and organise knitting circles, who saw their war work as an extension of their traditional role as benevolent ladies helping the less fortunate. Some of them were genuinely helpful, organising supply drives, running convalescent homes for wounded soldiers, that sort of thing. But some of them seemed tone-deaf, almost comically out of touch with the reality of what was happening. There are newspaper accounts from 1915 and 1916 about society ladies who would visit hospitals to cheer up wounded soldiers, treating it almost like a social call, chatting about fashion and who'd attended which party, while these men who'd survived horrors beyond description tried to be polite to women who lived in a completely different reality. The class divide that had always existed became even more stark during the war. Working-class women were in the factories being poisoned. Middle-class women were nursing men dying of horrific wounds. And some upper-class women were organising charity teas. Not all of them, to be fair. Some aristocratic women genuinely threw themselves into war work. They transformed their country estates into hospitals. They drove ambulances. They worked as nurses despite having no practical training. Lady Londonderry, for example, was a powerful political hostess who used her influence to improve conditions for women war workers. She visited munitions factories, lobbied for better safety measures, pushed for equal pay, though she didn't succeed on that last point. But the contrast between women who were genuinely transformed by the war and women who were just waiting for it to end so things could go back to normal, that contrast was visible and it was judged. After the war, there would be no patience for the old model of the ornamental lady who contributed nothing but decoration. The war had proved that women could be so much more, and that knowledge couldn't be erased. Now let's talk about what happened to relationships during this period, because the war disrupted not just work and social structures, but the most intimate aspects of life. Courtship, marriage, sex, everything changed. First there was the pressure. Young couples who might have taken years to court properly were suddenly rushing into engagements and marriages because he was shipping out and might never come back. Weddings that in peacetime would have taken months to plan were thrown together in weeks. And then he'd leave. For training, for the front. And she might never see him again. Or he might come back completely changed, traumatized, physically disabled, psychologically destroyed. The casualty rates were so high that there was this grim calculation happening in every family with sons or brothers or fiancés or husbands. Probably, statistically, he won't come back. The odds were just terrible. If you were an officer, which most upper and middle-class young men were, your chances of surviving the war were maybe 50-50 at best. For some regiments, some battles much worse than that. So women lived in this state of suspended grief, waiting for news, dreading the telegram that might arrive at any moment telling them he was dead. And when the telegrams came, and they came in torrents, thousands per day at the worst periods, women's lives shattered. Fiancés killed before the wedding, husbands killed leaving young widows with children, brothers killed, eliminating the male heir and throwing family inheritance into crisis. Vera Brittain lost her fiancé Roland in December 1915, lost her brother Edward in 1918, just months before the war ended, lost two close friends, Geoffrey and Victor, both killed in 1917 and 1918. By the time the war ended, when she was only 24 years old, all the men she'd loved most in the world were dead, and she was one of thousands of women in that situation. An entire generation of women who would never marry because there were no men to marry. They'd been killed. They were called surplus women, which is such a cruel term for women whose lives had been destroyed by catastrophic loss. And then there were the women who did terrible things because they were desperate or afraid, or just because wartime disrupts all normal moral frameworks. There was a phenomenon, documented but not much discussed at the time, of women having affairs with soldiers about to ship out, or with wounded soldiers in hospitals. Women whose husbands were at the front having relationships with men who were home on leave. Some of it was genuine connection, genuine love born in extraordinary circumstances. But some of it was just... the world was ending, morality seemed irrelevant. Why not grab whatever pleasure or comfort you could find? And the illegitimacy rate during the war years went up significantly. Women getting pregnant outside of marriage, either because their fiancé had been killed before they could marry, or because they'd had an affair, or because they'd been assaulted. Sexual violence against women increased during the war, both from soldiers on leave and from men in positions of authority exploiting women in desperate situations. And the social stigma of illegitimate pregnancy hadn't changed. These women were still ruined, still shamed, still often abandoned by their families. The war was revealing truths about human nature that the elaborate social structures of the Edwardian era had been designed to conceal. People aren't naturally self-sacrificing and noble. They're capable of nobility, yes, but also of cruelty, exploitation, selfishness. The veneer of civilization was thin, and the war had stripped it away. What remained was humans in extremis, doing what they had to do to survive, and not all of it was pretty. But here's what's also true. The war revealed capacity in women that had been suppressed for generations. Courage, endurance, competence, the ability to do difficult, dangerous work and do it well. The ability to lead, to organize, to solve problems. And once women had demonstrated those capabilities, once they'd proved beyond any doubt that they weren't the weak, emotional, intellectually limited creatures that Victorian ideology had claimed, there was no going back. The men who'd been at the front had seen women driving ambulances under fire. They'd been nursed by women who didn't flinch at horrific wounds. They'd received ammunition made by women's hands. The old arguments about women being too delicate, too irrational, too incompetent to be trusted with responsibility, those arguments had been definitively disproven. And so in 1918, when the war finally ended, when the guns fell silent on November 11th and everyone tried to figure out what peace even meant after 4 years of destruction, Parliament passed the Representation of the People Act. Women over 30 who met certain property qualifications got the vote. Not full equality, not yet, but a massive victory. Recognition that women had earned political rights through their war service. Emmeline Pankhurst, who'd suspended the suffragette campaign in 1914, could claim vindication. The vote had been won, not through the militant tactics of the pre-war years, but through the demonstration of women's essential contribution to the war effort. Though you could argue that without the pre-war campaign, without those years of protests and arrests and force feedings, the government wouldn't have been primed to see women's war work as deserving of political reward. Both the militancy and the service mattered. Both were necessary. But the victory was bittersweet. So many of the women who'd fought hardest for the vote didn't live to see it. Some had died in the war. Nurses killed in bombardments, munitionettes killed in explosions. Some had died from the health consequences of their activism. Lady Constance Lytton, remember, had destroyed her health through force feeding and died in 1923 at age 54. And even the women who survived to vote in the 1918 election. What were they voting for? A world that had been destroyed, a future that was deeply uncertain, a peace that felt less like victory and more like exhaustion. And what about the men who came home? The ones who survived? They came back changed, traumatized, many of them, shell-shocked, physically disabled, and they came back to a country that had changed too. Women had tasted independence. They'd experienced work that mattered. They'd discovered capabilities they didn't know they had. And now they were expected to just... what? Go back to being decorative? Return to domestic service? Give up their jobs to the returning soldiers and go quietly back to the home? Some did. Some women were relieved to leave the factories, to escape the danger and the exploitation. But others didn't want to go back. They'd experienced something different, and they wanted more. They wanted to keep working, keep earning, keep being independent, and this created enormous tension in the post-war years. Men returning from the front expected their jobs back. That had been promised. But the women working these jobs didn't want to leave, and so began a new conflict, a new negotiation over what women's place in society would be. But we're not there yet. We're still in the war years, still in that period of transformation and loss and discovery, and what we need to understand before we can move forward is what was happening to the aristocratic world during this time. Because while working-class women were in factories and middle-class women were nursing and everyone was dealing with loss and change, the great estates, the manor houses, the world of elaborate elegance we started this story with, they were dying. Quietly, almost unnoticed amidst the larger tragedy of the war, but dying nonetheless. And what the death looked like. What happened to those women who'd been the queens of elegance in a world that no longer existed? That's where we need to go next. Imagine walking through a great country house in 1918, one of those magnificent estates we talked about at the beginning of this story, the kind of place that had hosted elaborate house parties where 100 servants once maintained 30 bedrooms and gardens that stretched for acres. You'd notice the silence first. That's what everyone who visited these houses after the war commented on. The silence. The ballrooms were dark, the furniture covered in dust sheets. The gardens were overgrown, the gardeners had gone to war and hadn't come back. Whole wings of the house were closed off because there weren't enough servants left to maintain them, and the family couldn't afford to hire more even if they could find them. The great estates that had seemed eternal, unshakable, were suddenly empty shells, haunted by memories of a world that would never return. This wasn't happening to just a few houses. This was happening across Britain, across Europe. The aristocratic world was collapsing, and it was collapsing fast. Let's talk about the economics first, because that's what killed the system more than any ideology or political movement could have. The war cost money, enormous, unprecedented amounts of money. The British government's war expenditure was roughly £9 million per day at the peak. £9 million per day. That money had to come from somewhere, and much of it came from taxes on wealth and estates. Remember those death duties we mentioned before? By 1919, estate taxes had increased